That night, Miller Creek felt as if it were holding its breath. A small Kentucky town where people recognized one another by the sound of a front door closing suddenly felt wrong. Within just a few hours, 4 teenagers, kids, everyone knew from the football field, the corner store, the weekend cookouts were simply gone. No calls, no footprints, only the silent outline of a dirt road called Devil's Bend, where the night fog hung so thick it seemed to swallow sound. Their parents called again and again, voices trembling. Neighbors turned on porch lights, staring toward the pitch-black road no one in town dared take after sunset. Local officers drove slow patrols, red and blue lights slicing through the bare trees. And in that moment, everyone understood this wasn't harmless teenage lateness. This was something worse. Something no one in Miller Creek ever imagined would happen to their own children. The 4 teens left the stadium laughing. But only minutes later, they vanished into the night. And the town of Miller Creek would never be the same again. Miller Creek is the kind of town you pass through and immediately slow down, for where old wooden porches lean toward the road, faded American flags hang outside nearly every home, and cornfields stretch so far they blur into the horizon. Life here moves at the pace of the church bell that rings every Sunday morning. Folks know each other so well they can identify a neighbor just by the shape of a silhouette behind a windshield. On crisp autumn nights, the entire town gathers at the high school football field, where warm yellow lights spill over the wooden bleachers and the smell of hot popcorn drifts through the crowd. That field is the heartbeat of Miller Creek. Simple, steady, unchanged. In that world, 4 teenagers grew up like every small-town southern kid before them. Evan, the football captain and the only son of a farming family, carried a wide grin and a dream of becoming the first in his family to go to college. Josh, his best friend since they were 8, was the quiet, gentle one, always helping his father at the small garage on Main Street. Mia, with her bright, eager eyes, loved photography and spent her afternoons capturing the calm, ordinary beauty of the town. And Claire, the youngest, often joked that Miller Creek might be small, but the kindness here made it feel big enough to hold everyone. They grew up side by side. Sunday church trips, summer campouts at the forest edge, long, sun-soaked afternoons that felt endless. Their parents knew one another so well they didn't bother knocking when visiting. To the whole community, these 4 weren't just friends, they were extensions of one another. 4 pieces of a single family stretched across porches, shared dinners, and countless football seasons. And maybe that's why their disappearance cut so deep. It wasn't just a case, it was a crack running straight through the center of the town's heart, a shattering no one in Miller Creek ever imagined could happen in a place where children were believed to be safe walking home at dusk. Miller Creek once felt untouched. But the disappearance of those 4 familiar faces forced the town to look inward, to wonder what lay beneath the quiet surface they had trusted for so long. Their final night began like any other Friday in Miller Creek. Under the towering yellow stadium lights of the high school field, the grass glistened with a thin layer of dew. Wooden bleachers creaked as neighbors squeezed into their usual spots. The smell of grilled sausages drifted through the air, mixing with the brass of the marching band, a kind of atmosphere you only find in small-town America. Here, football wasn't just a sport, it was a gathering, a weekly ritual where adults traded stories of old seasons and kids ran around with cups of soda that sloshed dangerously close to the rim. Evan stood at midfield in his familiar number 17. Each time he caught the ball, the bleachers erupted, led by the loudest cheer of all, the one from his mother in the front row. Josh sprinted along the sidelines, doing his support duties, flashing a grin whenever someone shouted his name. Mia sat high in the stands with her little camera around her neck, trying to capture the glow of the lights reflecting off the damp turf. Claire leaned against the fence with a cup of hot chocolate warming her hands, insisting that nowhere else but Miller Creek could fall nights look this beautiful. The game ended with applause that lingered in the cold air. Parents wrapped their arms around their kids. Neighbors shook hands, still buzzing from the victory. No one knew it would be the last time they watched the four teens walk off the field with such easy smiles. Around 9:30, as the crowd thinned, the group wandered to the snack stand beside the stadium. They joked about an upcoming test, about the camping trip they wanted to squeeze in before winter settled in for good. Simple talk. Small plans, the kind 17-year-olds make without ever imagining time could run out. Evan said they'd take the usual shortcut home. Josh nodded. Mia adjusted her camera for one final photo of the night. Claire laughed and said she hoped the temperature wouldn't drop any further. Nothing seemed unusual. No warning signs. Just ordinary moments, quiet, unremarkable minutes that the town would replay again and again, wondering how no one realized they were witnessing the last of them. After leaving the stadium, the four teens drove their blue Chevy Blazer along the familiar road that cut through the center of town. Soft yellow streetlights washed over storefronts that had closed hours earlier. It was a stretch every person in Miller Creek had traveled more times than they could count. Quiet, slow, and never once the sight of anything worth remembering. At about 9:42 p.m., they pulled into the old gas station at the corner intersection. A small place with a faded tin roof and windows covered in soda ads that hadn't been replaced in 40 years. Locals stopped there for last-minute snacks, a quick fill-up, or to hear the owner retell stories he'd already told a dozen times. Security footage captured the moment. The Chevy rolled to a gentle stop. Evan walked in first, his stride heavy from the game. Josh grabbed 2 bottles of water from the cooler, still talking about something that made Mia laugh. Claire stood near the counter, fiddling with the keys, eyes drifting toward the dark outside, as if measuring how quickly night had swallowed the town. They chatted with the owner about the most ordinary things: which road had fewer potholes, which stretch was under repair, whether Devil Bend had washed out after last week's rain. He remembered Mia's laugh clearly, how she'd said they'd taken that road hundreds of times. To them, it wasn't a dangerous shortcut, just a dark, quiet country road. But in the footage, one detail made investigators replay the tape again and again. A brief second, when Claire turned her head toward the parking lot, her gaze following something, or someone, beyond the reach of the camera. It was subtle. No words, no clear movement. But her eyes held a flicker that was impossible to ignore, as if someone was standing just outside the glow of the station lights. 12 minutes after they arrived, the glass door swung open again. The 4 teens walked out, carrying what would be their last soft burst of laughter. The Chevy Blazer backed out, turned onto the road leading straight toward Devil Bend. Its red taillights blinked once, then vanished behind the dark wall of trees. It was the last time anyone ever saw them alive. The next morning, Miller Creek woke to its usual calm. The sun had just risen over the low hills, and a thin layer of mist still clung to the wooden fences. In many homes, kettles whistled. The smell of pancakes drifted softly through kitchens. It was a morning no different from the hundreds that came before it. But inside 4 households, nothing felt normal anymore. Evan's mother was the first to sense something was wrong. She stood outside his bedroom, knocked gently, then pushed the door open. The bed was untouched. His clothes from the game still lay where he had left them. His phone didn't answer. She told herself he must have stayed over at a friend's house, something 17-year-olds did all the time. But a small knot of worry began to form. Across the street, Claire's mother stared at the empty chair in the kitchen. Her daughter always woke earlier than everyone else, always brewed her mother's first cup of coffee. But this morning, the house was strangely silent. She called Mia's family, then Josh's. No one knew where the kids were. By the time the clock struck 10, worry had turned into fear. Parents called each other again and again. They asked the same questions. Did your child come home? Did they text you? Each tried to keep their voice steady, but beneath every word was a tightness in the chest no one could shake. The missing person call was made soon after. The one who dialed was Josh's father. His voice trembled slightly as he told the police that the 4 teens had been together all night, that none of them had returned home, that this had never happened before. The local officers asked a few routine questions, then paused. A long, heavy silence. And in that silence, every parent understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't kids staying out too late. Morning in the small town began with the familiar sounds of American country life. The soft thud of car doors closing, the wind brushing across old wooden porches. Yet beneath that quiet routine, something felt cracked open, as if the entire community sensed at the same moment that this day would not resemble any day they had lived before. When word spread from the parents' homes that the kids were missing, neighbors started gathering at the gates. Faces still puffy from sleep turned suddenly worried. Some brought hot coffee. Others just stood still, arms wrapped around themselves, as if trying to steady the rhythm of a heart beating too fast. In rural America, where everyone knows the name of your dog and the color of your mailbox, a missing child is never just a family's burden. It becomes the town's. Soon the first volunteers arrived. They carried flashlights, gloves, and the quiet determination to do what was right. No one waited for instructions. They split into small groups on their own. Some headed toward the wide fields behind the houses. Others combed through the pine woods near the narrow highway. Every step, pressed into the damp morning ground, carried the same whispered hope that somewhere out there, a child was waiting to be found. The rumble of a police engine drifted through the cold air. Search dogs were unloaded from the back of the cruiser, their eyes sharp and focused. The handler knelt, resting a hand gently on each dog's neck, as if reminding them that today mattered more than most. Then, suddenly, a bark cut through the heavy stillness. Clear, urgent. It made everyone freeze for a heartbeat, hoping it meant something good. Search teams pushed through the familiar trails where kids rode their bikes every afternoon. They called the children's names, each voice different but carrying the same tremble of fear. The mother's eyes shone with worry, the father's eyes hardened with determination, because every parent knows, in a place deeper than words, that this is the kind of fear no one ever wants to imagine for their own family. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows of those searching stretched long across the ground while they checked every hedge, every fence line, every forgotten shed in a neighbor's yard. Sometimes they stopped, thinking they heard something. Sometimes they ran toward a faint sign that turned out to be nothing. And each time, the silence afterward felt heavier, as if everyone could hear their own disappointment breathing back at them. The small town had never looked like this. A quiet place suddenly transformed into a map of fragile hope. Still, no one quit. No one allowed themselves to slow down, because when a child goes missing, a whole community steps into the search. Not because they were asked, not because it is expected, but because the heart gives them no other choice. As the morning drifted on under the tight, breathless tension hanging over the entire town, the police officially joined the search. They arrived with maps, investigation kits, and the solemn expressions people in Miller Creek only saw during the heaviest of moments. In small American towns, police officers aren't just officers. They're neighbors, former classmates, the people who once helped fix a fence or drove your kid home in the rain. So when they showed up, everyone knew something had shifted into a different territory. Inside the family's home, investigators spread large sheets across the kitchen table. They reconstructed every step the kids took, every time frame, every familiar road. The mother stood behind them, hands trembling as she held her child's jacket, as if gripping it tighter might somehow pull everything back to normal. The father sat across from her, answering each question with a hoarse voice from lack of sleep, though his eyes worked hard to appear steady. Both parents understood that in this moment, even the smallest detail could be a key. Police retraced the route from the night before. From the front door, across the dew-covered lawn, to the street corner where the kids usually waited for the school bus. They paused there, scanning the area as if listening for echoes of what had happened. A young officer bent down to pick up a scrap of paper caught in the curbside breeze. But it was nothing useful. Footprints still faintly marked the ground, but no one could tell which belonged to whom. When they reached the turn toward the pine woods, the air seemed to slow. According to friends and parents, the kids rarely used that path. It was too dark, too empty. Yet the tracks pointed that way. A small deviation, but enough for the investigators to exchange wary looks. In missing person cases, the unusual rarely announces itself with a shout. It just sits there quietly, waiting for someone sharp enough to notice. The officers continued reconstructing the final minutes. They pulled footage from the nearest convenience store camera. The image was grainy, but clear enough to make the entire room lean in. One of the kids appeared for just a few seconds. The walk was slightly faster than usual. Not a run, but no longer the easy stride of a carefree evening. No one followed behind. But something in the frame felt off, as if the child kept glancing toward someone standing just outside the camera's reach. It was the first strange sign, and it made every heartbeat in the room pick up speed. When the screen flickered black again, a heavy silence settled across the space, because everyone understood. That clue didn't just reveal the direction the kids had gone. It revealed that something had disrupted their familiar path. And from that moment on, the case stopped being a simple search. It became a pursuit of questions no one yet knew how to answer. When investigators followed the trail toward Devil's Bend, they stopped at mile marker 11, a rusted stretch of guardrail that every local in Miller Creek recognized, a landmark that had outlived generations and held more stories than many front porches in town. In a place this small, anything that changes stands out. But what caught the officers' attention that day wasn't a change. It was an absence. A car veering off course, drifting too close, even brushing lightly against the rail. It always leaves something behind. A scrape, a strip of chipped paint, a dent in the metal. Every officer knows this instinctively. But the guardrail at mile marker 11 was spotless. No paint, no scratches, no disturbed metal, nothing. As if no vehicle had passed near it for months, the officers stood silently, listening to the wind sift through the bare trees behind them. A mother, one of the parents of the missing teens, stood only a few feet away, hands clasped tightly against her chest. Her eyes searched the rail for anything, even the smallest thing that might say, yes, they stood here. Yes, they were alive at this spot. A thread of fabric, a smear of dirt, a hint of disturbance. But the emptiness only tightened the pressure in her chest. No evidence meant no answers, and no answers meant the fear was about to grow another layer. A young officer knelt near the pavement. He pressed his fingers into the thin layer of dust on the road. Something made him pause. The dust wasn't disturbed, no tire drag, no skidding marks, no sign of a vehicle fighting for control. The road was untouched. Calm in a way that felt wrong. Calm in a way that made your skin prickle. A veteran officer shook his head. He had worked dozens of accidents along this bend, and every single one had left marks. But here, nothing. As if the teen's vehicle had never even approached mile marker 11. As if their journey had simply dissolved somewhere before reaching this point. An invisible gap. A hole in logic the mind couldn't step across. Town residents began to gather along the roadside, watching the police with growing unease. Every one of them had driven this stretch of road hundreds of times. Everyone knew that even the slightest shift of a car left evidence behind. The lack of evidence spread fear faster than any rumor. Officers measured distance, photographed everything, checked the pavement again and again. But they all circled back to the same chilling question. As word of the disappearance spread through town, fragments of stories began to surface. They weren't evidence, just recollections. Scattered memories belonging to people who lived in a place where everyone knew everyone else. And in a town like that, any unfamiliar shadow became something. The first person to mention it was Martha, the late-night owner of the small convenience store on Main Street. She didn't call it a sighting. She called it a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right. She remembered hearing a loud engine rumbling from the far end of the street as she was locking up. A dark-colored truck. Big, high off the ground, the kind you'd expect from long-haul drivers or from the kind of men who lived so far out in the woods that no one really knew what they did for a living. But this was a small town. Folks recognized every truck that drove by each night. And that one wasn't on the list. Martha recalled the headlights being too bright, too blinding for such a narrow road. The beams hit the storefront windows so hard she had to lift her hand to shield her eyes. As the truck passed, she caught only a brief glimpse of the driver, a man wearing a low, curved bill cap, head down, eyes never turning toward the sidewalk. But something about the way he gripped the steering wheel made her spine tighten. Not fear, something colder. A kind of detachment. As if he wasn't simply passing through town, but studying it. Detectives listened carefully. The time, Martha remembered, lined up almost perfectly with the window in which the 4 teens vanished. The overlap hung in the air like a held breath. One of the mothers sat in the corner of the room, fingers digging into the arm of her chair until her knuckles bleached white. A strange truck. A man no one recognized. Just those 2 details were enough to make her heart feel like it was sinking. Then, more fragments began to connect. A delivery driver reported seeing an unusually bright set of headlights cutting through the trees near Devil's Bend close to midnight. A young boy who lived 2 streets away said he'd heard an engine so loud it rattled his bedroom window. An old carpenter swore he'd seen a truck parked near the tree line, but when he looked again a few minutes later, it was gone. None of it formed a complete picture. But together, the pieces created a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something had moved through the town that night. Something that didn't belong. And maybe, just maybe, it had passed along that isolated road toward Devil's Bend at the exact moment the 4 teens were still out there. Police searched for any available footage, traffic cameras, home security systems, doorbell cams, anything that might have caught a glimpse of the truck. But Miller Creek wasn't a place covered in cameras, and the houses closest to the woods usually went dark early. When night settled in, it swallowed the only hint they might have had of the mysterious driver. Rumors spread, from the coffee shop to the gas station, from church steps to the benches at the town square. But for the parents searching for their children, these weren't rumors. They were the outline of a man they'd never met, someone who might have seen what happened. Or, worse, someone who might have helped create the emptiness now echoing inside their homes. Investigators marked this as the second major point of suspicion, not because they knew the truck was involved, but because in a town where everything felt familiar, the presence of a stranger was sometimes the loudest clue, and also the most frightening. When the search expanded to the outskirts of town, investigators turned toward Hollow Creek, a narrow stretch of road hugging a dry stream bed. A place locals often said turned pitch black after 8 o'clock, the kind of darkness where you could hear your own footsteps. It wasn't somewhere people visited unless they were taking a shortcut or running from something. A man named Taylor, who lived in a small wooden cabin a few hundred yards from the creek, reported something that made the entire investigative team stop writing. He recalled sitting on his porch, repairing an old fishing rod, when a pair of headlights swept across the tree line. At first, it looked ordinary, the thin, wandering beam of a car traveling on a rural American road. But just seconds later, the lights went out. Suddenly, cleanly, as if someone had flipped a switch in the dark. Taylor said the part that chilled him wasn't the lights themselves, it was the silence that followed. A silence so heavy he could hear the whisper of pine needles shifting in the wind. No engine noise, no braking, no crash, nothing. Just a flash of light vanishing into the night. And then emptiness. Investigators immediately checked the timeline. The moment those headlights went dark matched the approximate window when the 4 teens were believed to still be on their way home. The coincidence left the room frozen. One of the fathers stood by the window, gripping the wooden frame until his hands shook. He closed his eyes, as if trying to picture his son's face at that very moment, and wondering whether those headlights belonged to the kid's car. By morning, Hollow Creek was cordoned off. Officers combed the area inch by inch. They searched every blade of grass, every tire mark, every rock that could have shifted. But like every lead before it, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Nothing. No skid marks. No disturbed soil. No tire tracks dipping toward the creek bed. If something or someone had been there that night, it had slipped away without leaving a single trace. A veteran officer stood on the trail and murmured that sometimes what frightens people isn't the shape of the thing moving in the dark. It's the way it passes through without leaving footprints. The mother standing beside him turned away, wiping at her eyes before anyone could see. No trace meant no answers. And Hollow Creek, with its unnerving silence, felt like it was guarding something much larger than the woods themselves. Taylor's story spread quickly. At the cafe, people wondered aloud whether the disappearing headlights were tied to the mysterious truck seen earlier. At the gas station, a mechanic insisted that only someone trying to avoid detection would shut their lights off that fast. And the parents? They didn't want to confirm or deny anything. They just wanted to know whether that flash of light was the last moment their children were still out there in the night. Investigators marked it as the third major point of suspicion. A pair of headlights gone dark. A stretch of land with no footprints. A hollow, unexplainable moment in the timeline. Hollow Creek was no longer just a shadowed road by a dry stream. It became a pivot point in the case. A moment where every possibility grew heavier and far more frightening. As the search widened and fear seeped into every corner of town, investigators began long, quiet interviews with the families of the 4 missing boys. Not to assign blame, but to find the smallest, most fragile details that might illuminate the path the kids took on that final night. Yet those interviews quickly grew beyond investigation. They became glimpses into lives interrupted. Moments so human that anyone listening felt their chest tighten. At Luke's house, the living room still smelled of fresh paint. His father had been fixing the wooden cabinet the 2 of them built together that summer. When the officer asked his first question, the man froze. His hands hovered, unsure of where to rest. He said that the afternoon before the game, Luke left a small note on the fridge. "I'll be home early. Don't wait up." A simple line, but reading it now, he had to grip the table edge to stay upright. He had never imagined what "not home early" could mean. Or worse, not home at all. At Cody's house, his mother kept the basketball shoes he had tried on earlier that day. Brand new, bright, still holding the warmth of a boy growing faster than his parents could keep up with. She told officers she had heard him laughing in his room while talking to a friend. She said it was the purest sound she heard all day. And now, sometimes, she had to go into the bathroom, turn the faucet all the way up, and cry where no one could hear her. Noah's family brought out a picture of him with his little dog, Maple. It was taped to the refrigerator door. His father said that the night the boys vanished, Maple stood by the front door, barking in short, anxious bursts, as if calling for him. When he stepped outside, the dog stood still on the porch, staring down the dark road like it expected someone to appear. The father's voice trembled as he told the story, because in the eyes of that loyal little dog, he had seen what he feared most: absence. Logan's family spoke last, and they stayed quiet, longer than anyone else. They didn't cry in front of the officers. They didn't shake. They didn't break. But the house itself told everything. A slightly crooked family photo on the wall. A jacket draped over a chair, as if he had just tossed it there and would walk back in any minute. When asked how he seemed before the game, Logan's mother pressed her lips together, thinking. "He hugged me before he left," she finally said. "He doesn't usually do that. I didn't think it was a goodbye." When these stories were written into the report, the pages felt heavier. They weren't evidence. They weren't statements. They were memories, delicate pieces each family held onto, terrified that letting go would mean losing the last thread that still belonged to their child. A young investigator stepped out of Logan's house and lingered under the porch for a long time. When his partner asked what was wrong, he said quietly, "Those kids were supposed to be at school this morning, not in our case files." The interviews didn't give the police many new leads, but they revealed something far more important: a quiet, heartbreaking truth. The 4 missing teens weren't just names on a report. They were someone's children, someone's whole world. The reason kitchen lights turned on each morning and breakfast was made. The laughter that filled a house with life. And because of that, those memories transformed the investigation. It stopped being a task. It became a promise that no matter where the truth led, they would follow it. And they would not stop. From the very first days, the accident hypothesis was placed on the table as the most comforting explanation. A child walking alone on a quiet road, a dark night, and a single moment of inattention that was all it would take for tragedy to strike. The people in town wanted to believe it too. Because an accident, as heartbreaking as it is still easier to accept than the idea of an intentional act. But the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized nothing about that picture made sense. The first issue was the route. The road the boy took was familiar, lit just enough by porch lamps and windows that no driver could reasonably miss someone walking along the edge. Neighbors said they always paid attention when kids passed by, an unspoken habit of small American towns where people quietly watch over one another to make sure everyone gets home safe. No one heard the screech of brakes. No metal hitting metal. No cry for help. The breeze that night was so gentle that if anything unusual had happened, they believed they would have sensed it. Then came the most crucial detail. There were no signs of an accident, no broken pieces, no tire marks, no skid patterns, not a single physical trace indicating a vehicle had struck the boy. The body showed no injuries consistent with a collision. Everything was clean, silent, unnervingly silent. By the end of the second week, investigators sat down with the family and admitted they could no longer support the accident theory. The mother went completely still. To her, an accident had been the last fragile hope, proof that her child hadn't faced something darker, something crueler. When that hope collapsed, every fear she had been burying deep inside rose to the surface all at once. From that moment on, the case stopped looking like an unfortunate mishap. It became a larger, sharper question about disappearance, about intention, and about a darkness drawing closer with every new clue uncovered. The abduction theory didn't emerge from any solid piece of evidence. It came from something subtler, an unease that spread through the town the moment the accident theory was dismissed. A very human, very instinctive fear that someone, a stranger, had stepped into the quiet orbit of this place and taken a child without leaving a trace. For the boy's parents, that thought was like a tiny needle, sharp enough to keep them awake at night, but too faint to grasp. Investigators went back over every detail. Strange faces seen inside the convenience store weeks earlier. A car that lingered too long on the edge of town. Whispered stories from residents who claimed they felt watched during their evening walks. None of it was strong evidence, but together they formed faint outlines too unclear to confirm, too unsettling to ignore. The most haunting part was the timing of the boy's disappearance. Just a narrow window of a few minutes, when the streets were empty and the homes already shut for the night. In small American communities, people trust that children can walk beneath the trees and still be protected by familiarity. Yet it would have taken only a moment, someone pulling over, a door opening, a quick grab, and they could have vanished before anyone noticed. The boy's parents kept saying something felt wrong from the very beginning. Not a vague intuition, but an emptiness that settled over the house the instant he didn't come home. His mother once said that when she looked out onto the front porch, she almost sensed a shadow passing by, as if someone had been standing there moments earlier. These details couldn't go into the investigative report, but they stayed with the detectives, lingering like emotional fragments science couldn't quite explain. Even with weak evidence, the abduction theory clung to the case like a stubborn shadow. It couldn't be proven. It couldn't be dismissed. And that uncertainty made it the most terrifying possibility of all. Because if someone truly had taken the boy, it meant they had the time, the opportunity, and the cold precision to make a child vanish in the middle of a town that never believed such a thing could happen. The sinkhole theory surfaced only when the search team pushed farther into the southern woods, an area the old folks still called hollow ground, because beneath the thin layer of soil lay a forgotten maze of mining tunnels from a century ago. Tunnels that appeared on no official map, surviving only in the memories of those who had lived long enough to know the earth there couldn't always be trusted. Investigators didn't want to believe this theory. If it was true, it meant the boy might have fallen into a place where light couldn't reach. But certain details forced them to look closer. Fresh cracks had appeared along the narrow trail. A patch of moss had slipped downward, revealing the darker, wet soil beneath. The search dogs stopped here longer than usual, confused, as if sensing something beneath their paws. Nothing was conclusive, but every small detail nudged the team toward a possibility no one wanted to face. For the townspeople, the idea felt cruel. They had grown up hearing old winter night stories about the deep tunnels, stories whispered by grandparents, about echoes rising from the earth and names lost to time. When this hypothesis was mentioned at a community meeting, no one spoke. Only the quiet exhale of mothers, who seemed to be fighting away an image their hearts refused to accept. The boy's father stood motionless during the search that day. He stared at the damp ground, his hands trembling slightly, as if trying to understand whether this place could have swallowed his son whole. Those around him later said his eyes, in that moment, looked like someone bracing against the worst outcome, yet unable to stop imagining it. Specialists brought equipment to inspect areas suspected of collapse. But the soil ran too deep, the tunnels were too old, and the underground network far too complex to map completely. There was no clear sign the boy had fallen in, yet there was nothing that ruled it out either, and that uncertainty made the sinkhole theory one of the quietest fears of the entire case, a possibility both invisible and impossible to dismiss. A place where one misstep could make a whole world vanish beneath your feet without leaving a single trace behind. There was a moment never written down, never spoken aloud, when the entire town quietly understood it had reached its limit. The searches grew fewer, then faded altogether. The forests had been turned over. The streams examined stone by stone. The old tunnels scanned until only the echo of machinery remained in the hollow dark. And on a gray December afternoon, Miller Creek realized it had done everything humanly possible. But understanding is not the same as accepting. The families of the four boys kept their old routines. Each parent still turned on the porch light every night, believing that even a small glow was a message, that if a miracle happened, their children would know the way home. Bedrooms stayed untouched. Half-finished drawings remained taped to walls. Cleats still carried dust from the last practice. The mothers washed their sons' clothes again, even though no one would ever wear them. These small acts became their way of holding on to something time was trying to erase. The first winter without them arrived quietly and colder than any in memory. Everyone in town felt an empty space in the air. The school hung its Christmas decorations, but the laughter of the boys was missing from the hallways. The year-end parade still took place, but the row of seats where they always sat was left empty, an unspoken reminder. Neighbors brought baked goods to the families' homes in an attempt to offer comfort. But the moment they stepped inside, the silence was so heavy it made their eyes sting. On the day of the first snowfall, the mother of the youngest boy stood in her yard, looking up at the gray sky. She said winter felt colder this year because there was no small voice running inside asking for an extra jacket. Her words were soft as breath, yet they weighed on the entire town. Still, one thing kept them from falling apart. They had each other. They carried a shared grief, shared silence, and tended a small memorial beneath the old oak tree where the four boys loved to gather. The candles placed there never went out, even when the winter winds were sharp enough to cut through bone. No one ever said they had given up. They only admitted what some pains can't be solved, and they learned to live beside it, one winter at a time. 5 years had passed, settling over everything like a thick layer of dust. The town had almost buried its pain beneath everyday routines. The victims' families lived more slowly, carrying a quiet kind of endurance that everyone saw but no one dared to touch. Life moved on, but no one forgot. Then, on a sweltering summer afternoon, sunlight slanting across old rooftops, the air thick with the smell of dry grass, a man walked into the police station looking unsettled. He was a long-haul truck driver, someone who only passed through the town a few times a year. But that day, he came to share something he believed he should have said long ago. His voice trembled as he spoke. On the night the four teenagers vanished, he had been driving through Devil's Bend. He wasn't sure about the exact time or the exact spot, but there was one image he had never managed to forget. A car, with its headlights on, parked along the empty road, and the faint silhouettes of two figures standing at the roadside. Not two. One taller, one smaller. They seemed to be arguing, or struggling. And what had haunted him for years was that he never slowed down to see if someone needed help. When the officer asked him why he waited until now, the man bowed his head. He said he had thought it was just a family matter. He didn't want to intrude, but for 5 years, Every time he passed that stretch of road, he remembered the eyes of the smaller figure. Eyes that he now believed could have been silently pleading for help. Vague as it was, his account was enough to reopen the case. None of the previous reports had mentioned two people on the road that night. If his memory was true, it meant the four teenagers didn't simply vanish into the dark. Someone had been there with them. Maybe someone they knew. Maybe a stranger. Maybe the missing clue the entire town overlooked in those crucial first hours. The families reacted with a storm of emotions, hope tangled with pain, because the truth, if it surfaced now, might bring answers they weren't ready to face. But they wanted to know. They had lived too long in silence. And so, after 5 long years, an investigation that once seemed sealed shut began to stir again. All because of a fragment of memory carried by a man burdened with guilt for half a decade. A small detail, yet powerful enough to remind the town that this story is far from over. When the investigation reopened, the town was no longer the same. People had aged, storefronts had changed hands, and the roads had been repaved. Yet the old loss still hovered like a shadow that refused to leave. This time, the police returned with technologies they hadn't had 5 years earlier. And that alone made hope fragile. Faint began to glow again in the hearts of families who had been exhausted by waiting. A team of state specialists was brought in. They began by reviewing everything that had once been dismissed as too blurry or too weak to use. Old devices, grainy cameras, the broken signals, everything was run through new image restoration programs and light pattern analysis. But the most crucial clue came from a place no one expected. The GPS data stored in Travis's old phone. That phone had never been found on the night the boys disappeared, but when the family accidentally reactivated the old cloud account, the final data packets before the signal cut out suddenly appeared. Not clear coordinates, just fractured snippets of location signals. Yet with new route analysis software, the specialists were able to stitch them together like a thin thread leading back to that fateful night. The reconstructed path revealed something unusual. The boys' car had slowed abruptly right before Devil's Bend and then stopped for about 1 minute. That detail had been overlooked years ago because the data seemed too incomplete. But now, it lined up perfectly with the new witness statement. Someone had been on that road, and there had been a reason to stop. When the information was shared, the victims' families sat silently in the small meeting room of the station. For 5 years, they had learned how to hold back their tears, but in that moment, each of them felt their hearts dragged back to the very first days. Hope. Fear. Two forces twisting together until it hurt to breathe. Investigators dug deeper. They cross-referenced the GPS fragments with both old and current topographic maps. That's when they found a small discrepancy, just a few meters, but enough to matter. The car had stopped right at the edge of a little-known path, a narrow trail leading to a dirt overlook above Hollow Creek, a place everyone had long assumed held nothing important. But now, it had become the final lead. That night, as the lights dimmed inside the investigation room, the police chief looked out into the dark and said they were closer than ever. Not because of new technology alone, but because for 5 years, no one had ever truly stopped searching. Technology simply carried them through the last stretch of a road human determination had paved. And at that tiny deviation in the map, the investigation was preparing to enter its final chapter. When every final clue was laid out on the table, the investigation reached a strange stillness. Not an ending, but a boundary somewhere between truth and the limits of what people can imagine. Because even though the GPS data, the witness accounts, and the terrain signs all pointed towards something, no one could say with certainty what truly happened on that dark road at Devil's Bend that night. Experts suggested one possibility, that the 4 teenagers stopped their car for someone, that the encounter wasn't planned. Maybe they knew the person, maybe they didn't. Maybe it was an argument, a cry for help, or a situation that spiraled out of control in just a few seconds. The odd GPS stop, the sudden blackout near Hollow Creek, the silhouettes of 2 figures on the roadside these fragments connected but never fully, like a picture missing its most crucial corner. Another theory argued the car may have been forced off its route. The narrow side path, leading to the earthen drop-off, might have been where they crashed or were made to go. But if there truly was an external force, then who was it? Why did they vanish from every record? And how could someone erase all traces for 5 years? Some still believe the old tunnels and sinkholes around Hollow Creek hold the answer. That when the boys stopped, a misplaced step or a sudden slip could have created a tragedy. But even that fails to explain the witness who saw two figures struggling. Then there is the most human theory of all, that the 4 boys stopped to help someone in the dark. Someone hurt. Someone needing support. Someone they couldn't bring themselves to leave behind. And it was that kindness, their instinct to do the right thing, that pulled them into danger no one saw coming. There is no solid evidence for this, but it is the theory that breaks their families' hearts the most. It makes them proud and terrified, all at once, imagining the moment their children face something they could not protect them from. In the final briefing, the police chief said that some stories simply never find an ending. Not because they are unsolvable, but because time has carried away the answers we search for. What remains are the footprints of 4 boys on the heart of a town, the porch lights still left on every night, the memory that refuses to fade. The case isn't closed. It simply pauses here, at a door left slightly open. A door inviting people to keep asking questions, and leaving space for each person to decide what they believe might have happened on the night 4 teenagers stepped into the dark and never came back. As this story comes to an end, what lingers is not the unfinished theories, nor the unanswered gaps, but the image of 4 teenagers walking off the field under the last lights of that autumn evening. It is their laughter still echoing somewhere in the memories of those who loved them. It is the small, ordinary moments we all assume will last forever. The pain carried by their families, by the town, by those who lived with this case for years, is not something easily put into words. They did not just lose a child, they lost the future captured in graduation photos, the Christmas gifts waiting on a table, the familiar sound of a door opening after a long shift. They lost the tiny pieces of daily life that quietly hold a heart together. And in all that uncertainty, one thing remains certain: the love of those who stayed has never faded. They still place flowers on their porches every spring. They still keep the boys' rooms exactly as they were, as if tomorrow they might walk through the door again. They still retell the old stories, not to reopen wounds, but to make sure the memory of those 4 boys never disappears, even if they left this world in a way no one can explain. This story, with all its imperfections, reminds us that sometimes the most important thing is not finding the answer, but preserving kindness, compassion, and faith in one another. No town is too small to hold love. No grief is too heavy for people to stand together beneath it. And so we dedicate this final moment to a prayer for the families. May they find a little peace with each passing day. May their hearts grow lighter with each changing season. May the love they carry for their sons become a guiding light for others walking through their own darkness. May the truth, someday, find its way forward. May the small town be healed. And may the souls of the 4 teenagers remain forever wrapped in the love of those who never stopped hoping for their return.